broad area of broad area of systems and control, data science, and other related areas. So today I welcome Suryanarayan Sankagiri, who is a Ph.D. student at UIUC, for a talk on the robustness of blockchains to network delays. So I'll give a brief introduction about Surya. So I'll also inform that he is an alumni of IIT Bombay. So he is coming back to the campus virtually. So here uh, I'll just start with his intro. Surya is a fifth year PhD student in electrical and computer engineering in department of in electrical and computer engineering department at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. In 2016, he obtained his BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Bombay with a minor in SysCon. His current research interests are in modeling blockchains and analyzing their performance. So, without taking your time, I'll hand over to Surya and he will be talking more about his uh, research. Thank you. And over to you, Surya.
Okay, thank you very much for the nice introduction, and I'm honored that you have invited me to give this talk. I hope that you can all hear me and also see my screen, which I'm sharing.
Yes, we can hear you, and your screen is also visible.
Okay, yeah. So today I will be talking a little bit about my research into blockchains and especially how we mathematically model the communication aspect of blockchains and analyze what role that has on its performance. But I know that some of you may already have a good idea of what blockchains are. Some may just have heard the term but are not too familiar, and some may not know much. So I'm not going to assume any background at all, and I hope that even such people will be able to follow the talk completely. So please stop me at any time if you have questions. I don't mind. Um, and with that, let's get started. So the term blockchain was introduced along with the invention of Bitcoin in 2009. Uh, and actually that term has now grown to mean many different things. So we'll see exactly what it means with an introduction to Bitcoin in the first section. And then I will focus on one particular aspect about blockchains, which is its security against an adversary that is trying to disrupt the system. And then I focus more further and study the effect of communication delays between different participants on the security of the whole system. And that's where my research lies. And finally, towards the end, I will zoom out again and talk a bit about blockchains as an area beyond Bitcoin. So to start with an introduction to Bitcoin. So as I mentioned, Bitcoin is something that was invented in 2009. Um, and it was meant to be a replacement for a traditional bank. So it's supposed to be a somewhat decentralized bank, independent of any existing institution. And in particular, it's supposed to be what is known as a peer-to-peer protocol with no barrier to entry. So uh, I mean, anybody can quote join the system and leave the system at any point in time. And I'll discuss in little more detail what exactly this means. But the key point I want to emphasize here that Bitcoin was introduced as an alternative banking system. So to understand this point, let's look at a very simple model of what a bank does, right? So a bank has various clients. Let's just call them A, B, C, D for now. Um, And these clients make transactions to each other. So for example, the bank may receive a transaction saying A pays 1,000 rupees to B, uh, and oh sorry, there should be a D here. So D deposits rupees 5,000 and so on. So it keeps getting these transactions. It can get them through various forms, through checks or in person or electronically. And the bank's main role is to order these transactions in a so-called ledger. So what is a ledger? A ledger is a legitimate ordered list of transactions. Here, legitimate means firstly, uh, the bank needs to verify that whoever is making these transactions has an account with the bank. Secondly, this transaction was issued by that person. And lastly, that person's account balance is not going negative. So some simple sanity checks have to be done, and that forms a ledger. So for the purposes of this talk, that is the only role of a bank. A bank keeps accounts by maintaining a ledger and ensures that no transaction is fraudulent. Now, what do we mean by a decentralized bank? So this one central entity bank disappears and is replaced by some set of parties that uh, say that, okay, we will take on the role of a bank. We jointly will take on the role of a bank. So in particular, what that means is every such peer or every such person must maintain a copy of the ledger, right? Because they are each taking the responsibility of a bank. And of course, they can't function independently. They must all communicate with each other so that they have consistent copies of the ledger. Otherwise, it does not make sense. So it is possible that this person here gets to hear of a few transactions which these people do not. So it would add those to the ledger and then communicate that with all its peers and so on. Now, I want to emphasize that these parties that I have drawn, they are not the users or clients of the banking system. They are not the only users or clients of the banking system. Right? There can be many others who are not maintaining this ledger, but those who have accounts and are making transactions. Just like in a regular bank, it's not only the employees of the bank that are using the bank, right? You and I also use the bank. So similarly, we must ensure that yes, there are a set of parties that are maintaining this decentralized bank, but there's a much larger set of parties that are actually using the bank. So does this notion of a decentralized bank make sense? It may look a little awkward as to why we are doing this, and I'll try to address that. But if it helps you understand, you can think of as an intermediary step that even a bank itself has many computers on, and it kind of replicates all its data on each of those computers so that it's easily accessible to different people in different parts of the world or at different parts of the country. And also, even if one computer fails, the others are there to store the data. And now we go one step further and say that, okay, these computers are actually just held by different people that are not really under one central authority. Okay, so with this picture of a decentralized banking system in mind, we can get our first look at what are blockchains, right? So blockchains is a method by which these people can uh, maintain a consistent ledger. So what happens is these four parties are each receiving transactions from outside clients. And what they do is they say we'll pick leaders in a round robin fashion. So let's say first this peer is chosen as a leader. What does the leader do? It creates a block and adds those pending transactions into the block. So block is nothing special. It's just uh, literally a collection of transactions in some order. Having created the block, it creates copies and broadcasts them to all other peers in the network. Once those peers receive this block, they check whether it's makes sense or not, and if it does, they erase those other transactions from their memory because those are already contained in the block. And now this whole process repeats. In the meantime, some new transactions come in, shown in purple. As I explained before, not every transaction may appear to everybody else. And then the whole thing proceeds. You pick a leader in round robin fashion, it creates a block and appends it onto the previous block. And again, it will broadcast to everybody else. So what is the blockchain here? Well, at its bare minimum, it's just this data structure of a chain of blocks, and each block contains some transactions. So what we saw was the ledger before is now replaced by this blockchain. Little more broadly, this whole system with a bunch of peers interacting in this fashion is also loosely called a blockchain system. So we should keep in mind that the term is used in both ways. So this idea of maintaining a ledger in this form was introduced with Bitcoin. But this alone is not so interesting. So the key innovation of Bitcoin is something called proof of work and mining. And if you know, to appreciate what problem this solves, notice that if you want to elect leaders in a round robin fashion, your set of leaders kind of must be fixed and known to each other. So they must each have basically certain IDs or numbers going from 1 through n. Only then you can have a round robin fashion, like at every 10 minutes or so, leader I will stand up and then leader I plus 1 and so on. But what if you want to have a permissionless system, that is arbitrary number of people entering and leaving, right? So the arbitrary number in this as maintainers of this banking system. So for that, in such a case, we cannot have a round robin leader election process, and instead we have a different leader election process which is enabled by this proof of work and mining. So to explain that, let's introduce some concepts. So the main tool here is that of a pseudo random generator. So what is a pseudo random generator? It is a simple computer function that's publicly known, and it takes as input some value. We'll talk about it, and it gives as an output some x, which is a 256-bit string, and this x appears seemingly random. Right? What do I mean by seemingly random? It means that if I give two different inputs, the two values of x are perhaps are going to be equal with like very small probability. Now, in this particular case, what we give as an input is a block itself, and appended to that is some integer which we call the nonce. So we feed that into a pseudo-random generator and generate some x. And if this x turns out to be bigger than some threshold value, we reject it and replace the nonce with some other integer. And we check again, and if x is less than equal to some threshold, we accept it. So this whole process, what I just described, feeding in the block along with the nonce to a pseudo-random generator, generating x and checking its threshold, This process is called mining. And why is it called mining? It's because we are mining for the right, if like figuratively speaking, we are mining for the correct nonce in the space of nonces, which is the set of positive integers. Right. And what is the right nonce? It's that nonce which will generate an x less than a threshold. So now, how is the threshold set? Well, so threshold is to be thought of as a small multiple of the output space. So the threshold could be specified that, okay, the first 3 bits must be 0 and the others could be anything else. And that would happen with probability 1 over 2 to the 3, which is 1/8. Now, who is doing this mining process? Right, I described to you what is the mining process, but who is doing it? Well, all peers are simultaneously doing the mining process with different values of nonces, right? uh, and basically the first one to uh, get a nonce that satisfies the threshold can then declare that I am the leader. Now, for this to work, it's important that the pseudo-random generator is non-invertible. So you cannot say that I want an X of a certain type. What would be the nonce that generates it? So there is basically no other way. The only way to get kind of the right X is to just keep trying different nonces, uh, one after the other. So I can repeat this if you want, but this is basically now the form of the leader election process. And what is nice is that it does not require us to know beforehand the number of participants. Uh, Arbitrary number of people can be doing this in parallel, and the first one to find the threshold can say, okay, I'm the leader, and I broadcast a block. And then the fact that you are indeed a leader can be verified because you can provide this input as a proof, and others can quickly check whether yes, this input indeed leads to an X less than threshold or not. We no longer have round robin leader election, but we have an IID leader election process. So if for some duration of time the set of peers is the same, then each one is chosen as in an IID fashion. And then the so-called block generation rate. So at what interval will new blocks appear? That's random, but there's a certain rate to that, and that's set by this threshold and the total computational power of all the peers put together. So there are a lot of new things in this slide, and I can repeat if or I'm open to taking any questions if anybody has. So if I'm to summarize this slide in one word, so in one sentence, in the previous slide, we saw a blockchain system of how different peers can create a blockchain, but that relied on a leader election mechanism that selected leaders in a round robin fashion. And what this proof of work in mining does is it replaces that round robin leader election with an IID leader election that does not require the knowledge of the number of peers. So to summarize, this is how a blockchain system functions. There are an arbitrary number of peers that they can come and leave at any time they wish, and they each store and validate the entire blockchain. They keep mining continuously for new blocks, and whenever they are successful, they broadcast new blocks. So this kind of continues forever in time. Now, if we think about it, actually, this whole method of doing things is quite inefficient in multiple ways. For example, if we want each peer to store the entire blockchain, well, that process is kind of storage inefficient, right? You are replicating the whole data in each and every peer. Similarly, this mining continuously for new blocks, like each and every peer is continuously burning electricity in order to mine. So question is, why is it that the system is designed this way? And actually, these have some like negative consequences in the real world as well. In particular, you may have heard that like Bitcoin consumes a lot of electricity, similar to the electricity consumption of some medium-sized countries. And indeed, that's true, and that's because of this mining process, right? Because all the peers are continuously just doing this computation of the pseudo-random function. And if you just do it once, it hardly takes any electricity. But if one is continuously doing it, that takes a lot of electricity. And plus, the storage and computation inefficiency actually leads to some kind of centralization. So if you have these bunch of peers where their kind of resources available to them is denoted by the size of the circle, then slowly we have some kind of centralization. The smaller nodes drop out. So it's a legitimate question to ask, that why is Bitcoin designed this way, or why is the blockchain system designed this way? And the answer to that is that such a system provides security against an adversary. So what is an adversary? So the key point to realize is, in this open kind of system where anybody can join and anybody can leave, and you're not keeping tab, there's no central authority, any peer can behave arbitrarily and in fact maliciously, right? They can try to disrupt the system. And if a system kind of breaks down under such behavior, that would not be a system you want to employ in practice. So the key part about Bitcoin is that it is secure against adversarial attacks. And security relies on two main components. One is cryptography, and the other, the blockchain dynamics. So my talk is not going to focus much on the cryptography part. I will just describe one slide on it, and the rest of it is going to focus on the blockchain dynamics, which has a nice mathematical modeling and scope for analysis. So whenever we think of security, we imagine that there's a single adversary that coordinates all malicious activities. So there's this adversary sitting outside the system, and it can generate fraudulent transactions marked in red, and it can even control some fraudulent miners, and it can do perhaps much more. So that's the model that we have. And now some simple questions to ask is, can the adversary spend more money than it has? Can it spend others' money? Or could it propose blocks disproportionately often? So could it game the mining process? And the answer to all these questions happens to be no, thanks to cryptography. So basically, all these kinds of frauds can be easily detected and ignored. So the first couple of frauds is something that could take place in a regular banking system as well, and the reason it doesn't is because of certain cryptographic tools employed, in particular digital signatures, that gives you unique IDs, so only you can spend your own money. And we briefly mentioned about the non-invertibility of the pseudo-random generator, right? So if you uh, cannot decide beforehand what input will lead to a certain output except by just computing the function, then your only hope of generating the right nonce is to just try out nonces at random, and that is you're limited by your computational power. So the security of these digital signatures and cryptographic pseudo-random generators kind of ensures that an adversary cannot do uh, many of these kinds of attacks. And if it tries, basically it's evident that they have cheated. For example, if it proposes a block without having found a nonce that satisfies the threshold, then somebody can just verify it. It can check whether the input provided by the adversary satisfies the threshold or not. And can, if it doesn't, it can be ignored. But the adversary can do uh, some other things, and in particular, it can try out what is called the private attack. And this is something that is kind of peculiar to blockchains, and indeed Nakamoto himself. And so, in the first paper that proposed Bitcoin, uh, this kind of attack was identified and analyzed. So, what is the attack? So, let's imagine that the adversary is trying to buy this fancy car from the car shop, but it somehow wants to obtain the car without actually paying the car shop. So this is how it could go about it. So it could generate a transaction saying send 1 Bitcoin to the car shop. And nowadays, with the price of Bitcoin, you can easily buy a car in 1 Bitcoin. So it's generate such a transaction. That transaction gets included in a block. And okay, so the car manufacturer sees that, okay, such a transaction has been made. But in parallel, the adversary creates a different transaction which says, send the same 1 Bitcoin to my second account. And then it mines a block on its own, includes that transaction, but keeps it private. It does not broadcast it publicly to anyone. And then it builds an alternate sequence of blocks in private. So all of these red blocks are mined by the adversary and are kept private, while the other honest guys are just following the protocol and building blocks one on top of the other. So some time passes, and the dealer is happy seeing that the transaction is in the blockchain and sends over the car to the adversary. And moment it receives the car, it releases this red chain. And since this red chain is longer, this now becomes the accepted ledger. So this one transaction which says send 1 Bitcoin to the car shop is no longer in the ledger. And if you think about it, if all miners now start extending this chain, there is no way that this transaction will ever feature in this sequence of blocks, because these two are contradictory. So we are assuming, so for the sake of this argument, assume that the adversary has only 1 Bitcoin in its account, right? So since it has only 1 Bitcoin in its primary account and it has sent this over to its second account, this transaction is now invalid after this one, right? So the two cannot follow in sequence. It's one or the other. And because of this kind of private attack where the adversary has mined some chains in private and released them later, uh, this block, this transaction gets cancelled off. So we say that the ledger, which should be immutable, so it should not, there should not be any changes possible to the ledger once it's been recorded, that immutability property can be violated. So for this kind of attack to take place, the key point to notice is that there must be more adversarial blocks mined than honest blocks over a certain period of time, right? So this red chain must be strictly longer than the black chain, which means that there should be more red blocks than black blocks mined over an appropriate period of time. So this forms the basis of analyzing the private attack. So now we employ some mathematical language. So let EK be the event that the adversary kind of overturns K honest blocks. In the previous example, K was 3. So if EK happens, then that implies that the adversary mines more than K blocks by the time the honest miners mine K blocks, right? So again, keep in mind the picture, there's a single adversary coordinating some miners, and then the rest of the miners are honest. So the honest guys take some time to mine K blocks, and in the meantime, the adversary has mined strictly greater than K blocks. Now, we can't say a priori whether or not EK will happen, right? Because it's a random event. It depends on the mining process, and that is purely random. We know that the adversary cannot game that process. So effectively, this is a race between two Poisson processes. What are the two Poisson processes? One process is the rate at which honest blocks appear, and the other is the rate at which adversarial blocks appear. And let me discuss this in a little more detail in the next slide. So I'm introducing some mathematical language here to formalize things. So we can fairly accurately model the mining process as a Poisson process of rate f. Why is that? So let's assume that, at least in the period of time we are interested in, the set of users is fixed and they have fixed computing resources, and the threshold is also fixed. So think that in every microsecond, everybody tries to compute the hash function, the pseudo-random generator once, and they are successful with some small probability, say 1 in a million, or maybe 1 in 10 million, and they are unsuccessful otherwise. And then they keep trying. So the probability that any one miner is successful in 1 microsecond is really small, but whether or not it's successful in the next microsecond is independent of the first one. So at each time, it's like you're tossing a coin with probability of heads being like 1 in a million, and you keep tossing every microsecond. So on average, you'll be successful once every second. So that would be the rate of your success. And those who are familiar with Poisson processes can identify that that's the model of a Poisson process. Now, of all the people in the system, some are being controlled by the adversary. So let's suppose a fraction beta is being controlled by the adversary. And beta is, strictly speaking, not the fraction of miners being controlled, but rather the sum total of computing power. So we have to weigh things with the computing power that people own. And now these two, if you look at the blocks being mined by the adversary and blocks being mined by the honest guys, they are independent, right? Because they are trying out the pseudo-random generator independently. Now, if this fraction beta is less than 0.5, it turns out that the probability that that event ek happens actually decays exponentially with k. Uh, so recall that ek was the event that the adversary mines more than k blocks by the time the honest guys mine k blocks. Right, so if the honest guys have a higher likelihood of mining every time, then it's like saying that, oh, a random variable with a smaller mean, what's the probability that it exceeds a random variable with a larger mean? And this the mean and variance scale with k, and that's why by employing some standard concentration inequalities, one can prove this. And on the flip side, if beta is more than 0.5, you get it's highly likely that the adversary will succeed. So this C in particular is some constant that depends on beta. And now let's introduce the notion of a confirmation rule. So suppose a user treats a block as confirmed if it is buried k deep. So there are k new blocks below a certain block. Then the question to ask is, what is the probability that a k confirmed block is overturned? And if you think about it, that is equivalent to the event that some ei appears for I greater than equal to k. So either k honest blocks are overturned, or k plus 1 blocks are overturned, or k plus 2, and so on. And because this is a geometric series, by the union bound, even the probability of this bigger event turns out to be of this form, e to the minus ck. So when we say that a blockchain is secure, this is precisely what it means, that a block which is treated as confirmed kind of really stays put in the ledger and is not overturned. So in particular, in the example with the car dealer should wait for enough number of blocks, k, maybe k equal to 100 blocks. So that transaction should be buried 100 deep before it feels that yes, this transaction is now securely put in place, and only then it should hand over the car. So I'm going to conclude this section with some key takeaway points. Right. So we have seen that the Bitcoins, in the first slide of this section, we argued that cryptography helps us ward off some certain basic attacks. So Bitcoin security is now just boils down to these blockchain dynamics: at what rate honest blocks appear, and at what rate adversarial blocks appear. So those dynamics underlie Bitcoin security. And then we talked about this confirmation rule. And note that each peer can choose their own K in the confirmation rule depending on what they perceive beta to be and their desired probabilistic guarantee. Right, so this beta is not a publicly known figure. The adversary does not declare openly that, hey, I'm an adversary and I'm controlling these people. So it's something that one just has to estimate, and one would choose a conservative bound. So maybe beta equal to 0.3 or 0.4. You assume that 30% or 40% of the people are adversarial and are trying to attack the system. And then you can also say, okay, I want a 1 in a million chance of failure of being attacked. So based on that, one can calculate the K. But that's all what happens in theory. In practice, actually, people don't typically wait that long. They often just spend their money within like 10 blocks. So if I received some money in a transaction one, I just wait for that transaction to be 10 blocks deep before spending it onwards. So my security is limited to whatever I would get with k equal to 10. Uh, the reason why people do that is I think they believe that even the kind of attack I just described is unlikely to occur in practice. And that's mainly because of certain incentive structures. So it's kind of expensive for an adversary to do this kind of an attack, to mine blocks in private and try to overturn, simply because it's quite unlikely to succeed. And if it does not succeed, it kind of wastes those honest blocks instead of uh, using them to help the system and uh, gain some reward. So basically each transaction is accompanied with some tip. Those get added to the adversary, to the miner's account. And finally, if you talk to blockchain practitioners, they will kind of assume that this, I mean, if you talk to Bitcoin enthusiasts, they'll just assume that this blockchain aspect is secure. And so although it's not 100% secure, the security is probabilistic, as we just showed. Um, in practice, people just assume security. So this brings me to the third part, which is the effect of network delays on security. I think I have only around 15 minutes left, so I might need to speed up a little bit. Let me see. So the key point to note here is that we saw that blocks are broadcast over a network which has, and that network will have some latency or delay, right? Communication is not instantaneous. In fact, in this study done in the early days of Bitcoin, uh, people actually measured the time it took for a block to reach other people, and they got this kind of histogram with a long tail. So maybe around 90% of the time you receive a block within 30 seconds, but around 10% of the time it takes longer. And what we will see is actually the network delay aids the adversary. So that's the key point to keep in mind as we go forward. So in reality, the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network is kind of arbitrary. There are miners all over the world, and they are connected to each other in some haphazard way. If a new miner joins, it just connects to a few peers, again at random. So peers form an arbitrary network, and blocks are actually spread through gossip protocols. So each person sends the block to its neighbors, which then sends the block to more neighbors, and so on and so forth. So for a block to get from one person here to another person here, it may actually take multiple hops. But what we do is we abstract out these details and just assume that each miner has the ability to broadcast to all others directly, right? So we assume some kind of all-to-all connection. And in particular, the so-called synchronous network assumption says that honest-to-honest messages suffer a delay of at most delta, where delta is some known constant. So you can think of delta to be 30 seconds or 1 minute. Now, the description we had earlier actually relied on the fact that there was no communication delay. So if there is some delay delta, even if it's bounded, a consequence is that different honest parties have different chains. So for example, these two parties could have chains of length 4, but they could differ in their final block. And then these two parties could actually have chains of different length. So this miner has heard of this orange block, but this one hasn't. And so the picture that we have, we kind of draw a joint picture, and the blockchain kind of becomes more like a tree or a fort kind of chain. Uh, so what consequence does this forking have? One consequence is that if you just measure the so-called honest growth rate, which is what's the rate at which the height of this whole fork goes. The more forking you have, the slower will be the growth rate, because not every block is contributing to an increase in the height. In fact, one can theoretically show that as delta increases from 0 to some positive value, the growth rate reduces as this figure. So it kind of goes inversely with delta. Uh, Now, this has implications for security as well, right? Because we saw the private attack where the bad guys, the adversary was building a chain and was racing against an honest chain. Now, that was, since if the honest chain's growth rate is slowed down, it makes it easier for the adversary to build a chain to beat it, right? So in fact, your security requirement now becomes a little stronger, in the sense not just that beta should be less than a half, but it should be that beta is less than the honest growth rate. And if you want this beta to be moderate, you would set your mining rate f such that f delta is small. So here some design aspects come in. One needs to estimate what is a good value of delta in the network, and appropriately choose the mining rate f. So I think the preceding principles are important enough that we take a better look at it via this plot. So what this plot shows is the so-called security threshold as a function of f delta. Recall that f is mining rate, delta is the delay bound. And what this curve, the curve actually delineates the secure regime from the insecure regime. So what this means is if you pick a point below the curve, so your f and delta is such that it's, let's say, 1 over 10 and your beta is 0.25, then you will be secure. But if you're on this side of the curve, your protocol will be insecure. And clearly the maximum possible beta you can tolerate decreases with delta by the logic we discussed in the previous slide. So with, okay, so in this, I mean, fine. So this is like an if and only if thing, right? So that's, so that part was actually established very recently, that if you're below this curve, you're secure. If you're above, you're insecure. There's no gray area. But a question to ask is, what is the correct operating point along this curve, right? So suppose you choose a conservative mining rate, you choose f to be very small, and your typical delays are such that f delta is 10 to the minus 2, so you'll be operating here. And even in the worst case, say your delays could sporadically a little large, you're operating at this point. And so the amount of adversarial tolerance doesn't decrease by much, and people just say, okay, you're still secure against 50% adversary. And in fact, this is the design choice of Bitcoin. But the problem with the low mining rate is that your throughput is less. You're generating less blocks at a time, and you can handle lesser transactions. So you can say, okay, I'm going to increase my mining rate 100 times. And now I'm generating blocks 100 times faster, and therefore can handle 100 times more transactions. But now, how far can you go? So you say that, okay, my typical delay in the network is maybe around 1 second. So most of the time blocks are delivered within 1 second, or let's say 10 seconds. And so I choose my mining rate to be one block every 10 seconds. So F delta is 1. And I'm operating here. But what if occasionally your delays are 10 times as larger? So then the guarantees, theoretical guarantees, are perhaps as per this operating point, and they're significantly poorer, right? So what this analysis, this kind of uh, analysis shows is that the synchronous network model is perhaps not a very good one, and in particular, it does not tell us what happens in a situation when occasionally your delays are much larger than what is typically the case, right? And that may well happen in a real world network, right? I mean, typically delays are small, but every now and then you may suffer large delays. So that motivated our work into considering a random delay model, where we say that each honest to honest message suffers a random IID delay delta. So now delta is not a constant but a random variable. So for example, delta could be some delta naught, say 30 seconds with probability 0.9, and infinity otherwise. So we say, okay, it's arbitrarily delayed with probability 0.1. So in this way, it's like a relaxation of the synchronous model, right? Because synchronous model is a special case where delta equal to delta naught with probability 1. Why do we assume that this is random? Well, because these excess delays are often caused by factors that are beyond one's control, like packet drops, which happen due to network noise or network traffic, queuing delays, etc. So we abstract all of those out and just have this simplistic model, which nevertheless is a generalization of the synchronous model. And then we ask the same question, that can we show that the protocol is secure? In particular, can we show that the probability a K confirmed block is overturned uh, is kind of decreases exponentially with K? And indeed, we can. And the proof technique that we develop in the process is quite general and uh, applies also to the synchronous case. So in the next couple of slides, I'll just briefly talk a little bit about the proof technique. Um, so actually in all uh, blockchain like theoretical security analysis papers, there are these broadly two steps. First, there is a reduction step, right, where you try to reduce this real world incidence to some mathematical statement. So you say, suppose a K confirmed block is overturned. That implies that for some I, the adversary must mine more than I blocks while an honest peers chain grows by height I. This is very similar to what we just saw in the setting without delays with pictures. So this step is, I would call, a reduction. You started off with one statement and deduced that if this happens, then something else must happen. And then you perform a probabilistic analysis on these two processes, which is really a race between the honest chains and the adversarial chains. In fact, the difference between them is like a random walk. So the adversarial chain grows according to some dynamics, the honest chain grows according to some dynamics. The adversarial chain grows as a Poisson process. We already saw that. We assume that the adversary, since it's like one entity, it does not suffer any delay within itself. But the honest guy's chain growth is a little more complicated, and that's in fact our main technical innovation in this work. So we say, first we ask, when does the whole block tree grow, right? So we say that a new miner hears of the block at the tip with at least some probability p no matter what happens. And this p is probability that your random delay is less than the gap between the time interval between uh, the two blocks being mined. And if so, the longest honest chain must increase by 1. If you hear of the block, you always extend it. So this is the first statement is about the growth of the longest chain in the whole system. Now, if you fixed an honest user or honest peer, what about its chain growth? So in general, its chain is a little shorter than the longest chain in the system, but we argue that it's not much shorter because every time a new honest block appears, it broadcasts it, and this fixed honest guy hears it with some probability p. So this is like having independent trials, each with some minimum probability of success. And so the number of times you need to wait is geometric. So it turns out that an honest peer's chain is nearly as long as the longest chain in the system, with the difference being kind of a geometric random variable, which is easily controlled. So these are like two basic principles that we use in our analysis. Uh, and in fact, and they are quite general. They also hold for the synchronous model. And we were kind of forced to come up with these new principles because of our um, because we considered a new network model. So to conclude, I'll take maybe 3-4 more minutes. I want to talk about the area of blockchains beyond Bitcoin, right? And we saw that, firstly, to recap, the term blockchain can refer to the data structure itself, which is a rather straightforward thing that has remained constant across the years. It could refer to the consensus protocol that is used. In this case, this is the so-called longest chain protocol. You hear of you mine according to the proof of work process, and you broadcast your block, and you always adopt the longest chain you have ever heard. Or it could refer to the entire system. In our example, we had the banking system, but it could be uh, quite a different system that just requires different users to hold consistent databases. So most of today's research is actually on the third part, but my research has focused on the so-called consensus layer of blockchains. Uh, so it turns out that distributed consensus is actually quite an old field going back to early 1980s. But there's a difference between so-called classical consensus and the blockchain protocols. So classical consensus dealt with a setting where there are a fixed set of peers. And the main innovation of blockchain was that it kind of extended that case to an arbitrary set of peers. Um, there are classical consensus protocols of various flavors. In particular, there are two flavors. One dealing with only where some nodes crash, so they just suddenly stop responding, and others where some nodes are actually malicious. And the crash fault versions were more practical because earlier distributed systems were, as I said, just different computers within one company, and it's unlikely that one computer arbitrarily starts behaving maliciously. What's more likely is that they just crash in between. On the plus side, though, these classical consensus protocols are known to tolerate arbitrary delays, right? They don't need the synchrony assumption. When we saw blockchains really require synchrony, you can't let that delta go to infinity. And the second advantage of the classical protocols is that equivocators can be identified. So if somebody is actually acting maliciously, you can identify that, yes, this is malicious, and you can kind of terminate that person. That is not true. So actually, in the past decade, people have studied both kinds of protocols side by side and found that there are these trade-offs that that there does not seem to be a resolution to. In some sense, we cannot get the best of both worlds. And partly this is due to some fundamental impossibility results. In particular, there's something called the CAP theorem in distributed systems, which when adopted to blockchains is as follows: that no protocol can be functional under arbitrary participation and also be tolerant to arbitrary delays. And that's because really a peer cannot distinguish between lower participation levels and high network delays. If it does not hear from other peers, it does not know whether those peers have left the system or they are there but they are suffering from large delays. And you either proceed with generating new blocks, which would make you functional under arbitrary participation, or you stall, which would give you security under arbitrary delays. But you cannot have both. And that's all that that was my concluding slide. Uh, Thank you for your attention. These are a couple of papers that I have written in the blockchain area. I invite you to please take a look if you are interested. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Um, Thank you, Surya, for an interesting talk. So I'd like to ask audience if they have any question, they can unmute themselves and directly ask any question.
Yes,
Uh, uh, I've seen Professor Chatterjee raising a hand. Sir,
Yeah.
you can go ahead.
Okay. Um, I was wondering, Surya, uh, you have shown us several models. Okay.
right.
Uh, has there been any uh, empirical checks to verify the veracity of these models?
Okay,
Uh,
so
Look,
by
I'm
various models, you
not.
mean various
No.
network
Wait a
models?
second. Yeah, I need to clarify myself here. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the model, okay? But every model is built on the basis of certain assumptions.
Right,
So I wonder whether the assumptions, and in fact there have been several assumptions here, like IID and so on,
right,
which it will be nice to see them kind of verified in by means of reasonably large scale. Reasonably large scale. It's impossible to do really large scale. Reasonably large scale experiments. It's
right.
kind of experimental validation. Has this been done?
Uh, n- so the short answer is that I mean the only kind of experimental study is this very old, I mean by now old study of Decker and
Mm,
Wattenhofer. Uh,
mm,
so I personally have not done any, and even their study they just plot the kind of histogram, so you can't really check
mm.
whether delays are IID or not.
Correct.
Firstly, I mean, I think we can be fairly confident in saying that between any bit, if you assuming that between any two peers the delays are
Mm,
IID and that distribution is the same across all users, that's pretty unrealistic, right?
mm,
It's
mm,
more
mm.
likely that peers geographically closer have much lower
Correct.
delay, uh,
Absolutely correct.
and those who have invested in kind of better net bandwidth,
Right.
etc., have lower
Mm,
delay.
mm, mm,
So what I did not show you is the following. So suppose you consider this alternate model where you lay down a bunch of users, and
mm,
between any two peers, you set the delay once and for all to be like one particular random variable. So you draw links between every peers, and the delay
mm,
along each link is sampled according to some distribution, and then that delay is fixed. Thereafter, all
okay.
communication along those links suffers that delay. Even
Mm.
then, the performance actually is similar, and that can be simulated and verified.
Similar. All right. All right. All right. Very nice. Very nice. So there is, I believe, some fair degree of robustness uh, at the modeling end.
Right.
That's what I wanted to ask. Yeah. All right. All right. Many thanks. Yeah. Nice work, by the way. I wonder if any other models are out there, or is
Right.
this the first instance of such modeling?
So, okay, so our work is not the only relaxation to the synchronous network. So our starting point is always the synchronous network model where any
Sure.
peers suffer a delay delta. And even that is pretty robust because you actually give the adversary the control to delay things arbitrarily within this bound delta. So formal analysis actually respects that. But yes, sure, it is unrealistic unless you choose a very large value of delta. And so people have considered other models. One particular model is a so-called sleepy user model, where a random subset of users suffer large delays. And that can change from time to time. But everybody else suffers synchronous delays. So then it's like you just take the random subset of users out of the system for some time, and then they can come back in. So basically, it's robust to some flux.
Right.
And things like that.
Excellent. All right, that's all from me.
Thank you. Anybody else? I mean, I'm not sure whether the talk was quite at the right level, so I did not have much math in the slides. I hope I started from basics of the blockchain. I don't know whether I bored people or despite my efforts, I lost my audience very early on.
Well, you didn't lose me, but
Okay,
that's probably because I had no prior exposure to blockchain and I enjoyed the talk.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, I'm open to questions from anybody in the audience. I'm sorry, I do not personally know anyone otherwise, apart from Professor Devashish. Otherwise, I would call out people to ask questions.
Shovik, Siddhartho, Harsh, they are our PhD graduate scholars. Harsh is working with Ravi and I think Shrikant, but I'm not sure. Siddhartho is working with Ravi and me. Shovik is working with my friend Federico Ramponi at the University of Brescia and me. And the others I don't know. Narahari Suman, there's Rashid Khan, Saurabh Patil, and you, Suryanarayan.
Yeah, Palash is my friend here from UIUC. In fact, we had a interesting conversation a few days ago, and I tried to build my talk as a kind of trying to answer some of his